Okay, hello. This is Ki-Yuk Shin from Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. On behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome all of you to this very exciting event. As you know, this is part of Asian Leaders Forum, and this is the last one for this year. As you may know, we are having this lecture series to bring prominent leaders from Asia to share their ideas, their experience, and their vision for their own country and for the region and also for the world. And today we are very pleased to have Madam Ninh from Vietnam. As far as I know, this is the first time that we invited a prominent leader from Vietnam to our center. And also, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank once again Walter Shorenstein for your very generous support for this event and other program at the center. And this will be the last lecture in our Asian Leaders Forum, and we will reconvene in the fall for next year. Okay, now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Don Emerson, who's a professor and also director of Southeast Asian Forum at the center, who will be introducing our speaker this evening. So, Don.
Two months from now, in July, historians of U.S.-Vietnamese relations will note 3 anniversaries. It will have been 30 years since Vietnam was finally officially reunified. It will have been 11 years since the United States finally established full diplomatic relations with the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And it will have been 6 years since the two countries signed a bilateral treaty to promote trade between them. Our speaker today has had a biography that has been intimately intertwined with this history of her country. Indeed, her involvement in that history goes much farther back, to the days in the 1960s when, as a young woman in Paris, she first joined the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. It would take me far too long to recap the details of her career since then. Suffice it to say that in the field of diplomacy in particular, especially multilateral diplomacy, arguably no Vietnamese leader has represented his or her, in this case, country, more thoughtfully and articulately around the world than has Ambassador Ton Nhu Thi Ninh, our speaker today. And she is now in the midst of a second career as a member of Vietnam's National Assembly, where she is the vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So she has gone from diplomat to politician. Indeed, she has had 3 careers, having started out as an academic, teaching English literature at Paris University, Université 3, and the University of Saigon in the 1960s and early 1970s. In fact, her thesis, I found out today, was on William Faulkner. So she has had 3 careers. She's gone from academic to diplomat to politician. Is that progress? I'll ask her to answer that question. I'll stay neutral on that one. Ambassador Ninh is here, in a sense, if I may suggest this, between summits. She was instrumental in holding unified Vietnam's first major global summit in Hanoi in 1997, a summit of French-speaking countries. And this year in October, I hope she's not embarrassed that I mention this, again, I learned this today. In October, she will be back in the United States, this time not at Stanford, unfortunately, but in Las Vegas. Not attracted by the gaming tables, but to attend a summit, another summit, of the world's 100 most powerful women, being organized by Fortune magazine. She was suitably self-deprecatory about that phrase most powerful women, but I'm sure it is deserved, as you will shortly witness when she speaks. And a month later, that is in November of this year, back in Hanoi, she will be involved in the Asia-Pacific Economic Leaders Meeting, the APEC Summit, which will be attended, we hope, by the President of the United States, George W. Bush. And lastly, on a personal note, in March of this year, my colleagues and I had the extraordinary good fortune to travel to Vietnam and to spend an entire day in Hanoi at the Institute for International Relations, affiliated with the Foreign Ministry, interacting with Madam Ninh. I think I can speak unanimously on behalf of my colleagues. We found her extraordinarily thoughtful and extraordinarily articulate, as I dare say you will too, as you hear her discuss Vietnam's uniqueness in a globalized world. I give you Ambassador Ninh.
Thank you, Professor Emerson, for your most kind words. Mr. Shorenstein, Professor Ji Wokshin, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to have the privilege to speak for my country about Vietnam's uniqueness in a globalized world. I chose the topic because I've been pondering about Vietnam's place in history and place under the sun. And I've come to the conclusion that it's quite unique. And why is Vietnam unique? Why is the Vietnamese experience unique, especially today in the face of the opportunities and challenges of a globalized world? Very simply because of its past, which has been very singular, as you remember, because of the tangible reality of its present, which is unfolding before you, but also if we cast our eyes further down or further out, because of the promise of its future, which of course I believe strongly in. What do I have to say about Vietnam's singular past? All of you, I'm sure, will agree that it can be described as a long odyssey through bondage and war to assert its independence, its unity, and its identity. I trust that you will understand that to us, when Ho Chi Minh said, "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom," I believe honestly that not only the members of the Communist Party agreed, but I think that the whole Vietnamese nation agreed. Of course, to be lucid, a few interpreted the ways to independence and freedom differently. It was also Ho Chi Minh who said, more or less, because he was apt to be poetic, to wax poetic. He said, but an immutable truth, that Vietnam is one, the Vietnamese nation is one. Rivers may run dry, mountains may waste away. That truth will prevail forever. And that is carved in stone, literally, and in the minds of and hearts of Vietnamese. So that history is indeed singular, and it has forged a people, a nation, that is moved by a quiet, indomitable determination and by a belief in a better tomorrow. I will pause here to evoke a few anecdotes and episodes. Vietnam is a poor country. We are not an LDC. Still, we are a developing country, a low-income developing country. In other words, when you're in Ho Chi Minh City, you may forget that reality, but you have to go up in the mountains close to the border, go on the Central Highlands, and immediately, of course, you can see for yourself and you can remember that indeed Vietnam is a poor country. But in Vietnam, it is rare for you to feel any sense of resignation among the population. And that is an observation that was made to me but 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, by an American person by the name of Jerry Sternin, who happened to be then the U.S. director for Save the Children U.S. And he said, I've been working in many developing countries. In Vietnam, I've seen pockets of poverty comparable to the kind of material poverty I've seen in Bangladesh. But in Bangladesh, I have sometimes felt pity. In Vietnam, never. Never, not because Jerry Sternin didn't have a heart, but never because he felt he didn't have to. Because he said the very poor farmers he met with, he never felt they were resigned to their lot. He could always feel that they were determined to take their fates into their hands and to do something, to achieve something better, if not for themselves, then for their children and grandchildren. I would also say that if you observe the Vietnamese nation, people, you will see that we have this ability to bounce back, this resilience, this mettle in times of crisis. So a keen observer would see that sometimes we are rather easygoing, and we enjoy life when in times of peace. But when crisis knocks at the door, immediately we're all as one. War proved it, but not just war. Just for those who've been living in Vietnam, when the serious floods of 1999 struck, you will have seen how fast we acted. And it was not just the government, the population, just the regular Vietnamese. My third remark will be about not its past, but its unique geography and culture. So the past, but also its unique geography and culture. Vietnam is a crossroads, a meeting point, and a symbiosis of cultures and civilizations. It is a meeting point, a confluence of so-called chopstick civilization and culture. I'm quoting from former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. In fact, geographically, because there are only 4 original users of chopsticks. These are Japan, China, Korea, I mean the nation, not the country or political entity, and Vietnam. So between chopstick culture or Northeast Asian culture, some would like to call it Confucian culture, but it's not just Confucian, and Southeast Asian culture with its diversity. It is also at the meeting point between, and therefore Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, between East and West. After all, Vietnam, and between North and South. Vietnam has been under 1,000 years of feudal Chinese rule and under 100 years of French rule, colonial rule. And today, therefore, you can see this rich diversity in the Vietnamese cuisine. I bristle when people say, oh, Vietnamese cuisine must be a bit like Chinese cuisine. I say yes and no. It's a bit like Thai cuisine. I say yes and no. Well, it's a bit like Indian or Malay cuisine. Well, yes and no. At the end of the day, Vietnamese cuisine is all of that together and none of it. It is singularly Vietnamese. I hope those of you who've tasted enough of Vietnamese cuisine will concur with me that it has flavors from all over the region, but that it is singularly Vietnamese. Some of you may not know that we use the Roman script and not the Chinese characters. We used to, but and that's one good thing the colonialism brought to us, that is to say, the Roman script. it was a Jesuit father by the name of Alexandre de Rhodes who introduced a Romanized version of our script with diacritical signs in order to reflect our tones, because Vietnamese is a tonal language. So it's interesting that we're the only one to have this Romanized script. Korea doesn't, Japan doesn't, and China doesn't. Only Vietnam of the 4 chopstick cultures. So as I said, we're right at the threshold of 2 worlds. Perhaps that also explains that the Vietnamese people is characterized by greater openness. I stand to be corrected by friends from Northeast Asian countries here. Greater openness to the outside world, by a more visible joie de vivre. And in Vietnam, you will see a mix of individualism and sense of community. Just look at the Vietnamese riding their Hondas. They are not very disciplined. They don't look very communal there. They look very individualistic. But at the same time, they do have that sense of community that I mentioned earlier, in times of crisis and when the moment calls for it. So both history and geography, together with culture, explain to some extent Vietnam's ability to accommodate, to adapt, and still remain itself, retain its identity. It also explains its moderation and tolerance. Readers of history of Vietnam will see that our history, the history of our religions and religious life in Vietnam has been free from wars of religion, of clashes between religions. It has been, Vietnam has shown and is showing realism and pragmatism. In other words, what we do with external invaders is we tell them, please go home. And we even roll out the red carpet for them to go home. As soon as they cross the threshold, we invite them back. So they are not welcome as invaders, but they are more than welcome as businessmen, as friends, as partners, so on and so forth. In the old days, under the feudal occupation of China, after we fought them back, we used to go and our emperors used to go and pay tribute to the suzerain, up north, as long as they stayed up north, and not down here. And Vietnam's history, even the contemporary history, is characterized by an absence of swing to extremes. And we have this ability to make do and to survive. After 1975, many people were surprised in the streets of Saigon. I'm sure Mr. Snyder, a journalist, would be sensitive to that. There was those old Renault taxis that were out of production, that had been out of production for 20 years, but they were still sort of running around because the Vietnamese were so good at tinkering to make them survive 20 more years. And you also know that we have the famous Cu Chi tunnel network where some of us had to survive for years. I think this combination of history, geography, and culture also explains our ability, partly, not in all, but partly, our ability to move from past to present, to deal with the war legacies. And there is no better and more eloquent example of that than the relationship with the United States. I think that it has been, well, not easy, but it has been universally accepted in Vietnam that we should set aside the past and try to build a sustainable and constructive relationship with the United States. And our own veterans and the US veterans, in fact, have been movers of the normalization process. That is very remarkable. That did not happen after the end of the first Indochina War. I mean, there did not exist the same kind of bonding between some French veterans and Vietnamese veterans as has happened between American and Vietnamese veterans. It also explains Vietnam's ability to integrate modernity and tradition and to adopt modernity. If you go into Vietnam now, you will see that the young Vietnamese seem very much at home with things modern. But this doesn't say that they have completely discarded, the worthy traditions of the past, like ancestor worship. When you understand that ancestor worship is one of the means for the extended family cohesion, that is one of the strengths of Asia. It's not really to do with, religious belief. It is in fact a cultural, I think, institution more than a religious institution. If I may now turn to the present. Now, I've spoken of the past, but the evidence of the present explains also this uniqueness. The post-75 period or phase the phase before was a quest for independence and unity mostly, the post-75 phase has been characterized by the quest for development, for moving out of poverty. And it is our endeavor has been unique both in its results, successful results, in the circumstances of its process, and in the manner of its undertaking. After all, the decolonization of former colonies unfolded here and there in the world. But one of the defining features of our decolonization has been, I'm sorry again to quote Ho Chi Minh, because I deeply believe he's really the father of contemporary Vietnam. Now, Ho Chi Minh mentioned the external danger or threat and the internal threat. And the internal threat was what? Poverty and ignorance. And that was back in the 30s, 40s. And so this awareness that we need to be independent, but we must also, to be really independent, move away from underdevelopment, away from poverty. And to move away from poverty, how can you do that if you are illiterate? It was so logical and consistent and very accessible a message that was given us by Ho Chi Minh. And it has therefore, I think, run like a red thread through our whole decolonization and then resistance efforts to regain our independence. Then has come between 75 and 86, I think for a decade, that has been a decade of crisis. And fortunately for us, in 1986, as you know, the party, the Communist Party of Vietnam, initiated the so-called reform and renewal đổi mới process. I emphasize the date because some observers from outside, might think that it was because of perestroika that, we were moved to reform. But perestroika came later. And 86 already, we had launched that drive. And that reform and change has been reasserted through the 97-98 crisis. You remember that crisis. During that crisis, many superficial observers had given Asia for dead, meaning the miracles had been mirages, the center of gravity had stopped moving to eastward, Vietnam was sheltered somewhat from the crisis because of our underdevelopment, because we didn't have a convertible currency and there was no free flow of capital. But I think we were fortunate that our leadership in this case, thought properly and derived the necessary lessons. What lessons did the leadership of Vietnam derive in 97-98? First, Vietnam is still a rural nation. 75% of its population lives and works in the countryside. So you can't develop Vietnam by just, focusing on the cities. If you don't take the hinterland of the countryside on board, you can't achieve development. So you will notice it was in those years that we changed the name of our Ministry of Agriculture to Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, because rural development meant we need to take on board the farmers as well. The lesson also was it cannot be completely the export-oriented strategy of many of the East Asian tigers. Exports had to be combined with tapping the domestic market and the internal resources. So those lessons have been drawn, and I believe that they explain that today we are on the verge of a new surge in our development. Thirdly, I'd say that today, compared with a few other countries who are also trying to take off, Vietnam is characterized by its ownership of its own development. Here I will mention the rice revolution. You know that in India, their green revolution was due to the introduction of technique and technology into rice cultivation. In Vietnam, it was thanks to policy. No need for extra capital and not yet science. What turned us into from an importer, before 89, we were importing rice. After 89, we were exporting. And a few years after that, we had become the second world exporter after Thailand. So that is what we call Khoán Mười. What is Khoán Mười? There was a party secretary in a rice producing province called Thái Bình, who decided that if we use the old style, way of the state collecting all the rice from the farmers, they will not try hard. So what he did was he introduced individual incentive. So he decided farmers will have only to sell to the state up to a certain threshold. And above that, it would be theirs. They could eat it, they could give it, they could sell it to whomever they wanted. And output just grew. At first he got rubbed on the fingers, but shortly after, our leadership was pragmatic enough to see that it made sense, and then allow, the multiplication of that formula, the so-called Khoán Mười. I'll have to look into the reason why it's called that. But thanks to that, and therefore no, added injection of capital then, we were able to achieve that rice production revolution. Or in the case of ODA, some people say that we are the darling of the donor community. Of course, there are scandals about misuse of ODA money, and the most recent case in point is the so-called, project management unit 18. But all in all, roughly, I think that the ODA is most effectively used in a country like Vietnam. So UNDP, World Bank, they are often using Vietnam as a showcase for how ODA can be properly used. Or I was interested to see in an article in the Bangkok Post that was comparing Vietnam and the southern neighbor of the United States. I want to avoid mentioning names, and showing that in one case a lot of encouragement, facilitation, and on the other hand, much more drastic, difficult conditions in the past, in the 1990s in particular, and the result being, very different. So ownership of our development. The fourth distinguishing feature will be the combination of our internal strength and tapping external strength. Very frankly, this is the past now, but one of the lessons of the past, during the war, we tried to broaden the anti-war front. And where did we broaden it? Right here in the United States. Very frankly, never has the Vietnamese leadership thought that we can close our doors, close our borders, close our minds, and do something all alone. We are self-reliant, but in the sense that, well, we own the process. It doesn't mean that there are no foreign partners and no foreign supporters, external supporters. Pardon. And today, an example of that is the whole process of our foreign policy with its balanced integration and WTO. I mean, we're coming full circle. We believe that this will be the last major, ultimate major step for us to graduate into the World Club. We've been sort of entering several clubs in succession, but with the holding of the APEC summit later this year and our admission into WTO hopefully by the end of this year, our integration into the world and the region will have come full circle. And finally, I'd say that we have been able to achieve what we have achieved while overcoming the past legacies. After all, look at Germany, look at Yemen, and now look at Vietnam. Germany and Yemen reunited just as Vietnam reunited. But Yemen reunited two parts of the country, but that were not ideologically different. Germany did, Vietnam did. But Germany, it was the capitalist part that, reunited, that was taking the lead. In our case, it's the reverse, you see. And so we have had to deal with a very different case, and we have been dealing with the problem of having reunited after a long war and what ensued was a large exodus of Vietnamese people who today are the diaspora, major part of the diaspora, Vietnamese diaspora in the world. And so handling the reunification of hearts and minds between the North and the South has also been part of the journey of the last 20 years. And all in all, I would say that some lingering suspicions or resentment or animosity may remain here and there, but I believe that it's been a successful, human reunification between North and South. Now, just a couple of words about the promise of the future. Vietnam is singular in its position in Asia, as I said, between East Asia and Southeast Asia. Japan today looks to Vietnam as I would say, a good counterweight or an added partner in the correlation within East Asia, where things are not easy between Japan, China, and Korea. And Vietnam is on good terms with all three. So I think Korea also looks to us, in a sense, Japan also. So we are the convenient fourth party, you know, and also ASEAN, I think, because of our stability, because of our growing economy, and because, very frankly, also we have shown some maturity in, you know, hosting all those, you know, in being the multilateral player within ASEAN and within ASEM, within ASEAN +1+3, so on and so forth. So I think Vietnam has a role to play, and the promise of the future is for us to define what kind of role we can play, we should play. Second, I'd say the promise of the future is Vietnam's young population. Remember, while Japan is graying, Europe is graying also. Vietnam's population by 50% is under 25, 60% is under 30. So that's its most valuable asset. We're heartened that Bill Gates came, and you should have seen him. All the young ones that crowded to see him was like having a superstar, a movie star, you know. But I looked at that and it was very refreshing, because I think the example of Bill Gates was inspiring to many of our young people, you know. He had to have 4 bodyguards, you know, protecting him from the crowds. And I will mention in passing, therefore, that I'm not surprised that our government has decided to start a project on the creation of a so-called world-class university, meaning, you know, a top-class university for Vietnam. China has been engaged in that exercise for the past many years. It's high time Vietnam did it, and so we're getting started on that. We hope many young people will help us. Thirdly, the sense of direction and the sense of destiny. We in Vietnam are often joking that we say fate. We say fate has been weighing heavily on our shoulders, asking us to do things that perhaps other nations are not asked to do. The conquest of our independence was something that was symbolic to many nations in the world. Today, our efforts to escape from poverty and underdevelopment and to grow, I think, is being also looked to by other developing nations to see whether Vietnam can provide some sort of, let's say, suggestion or inspiration. So that sense of direction, I think you can feel it when you come to Vietnam. From the young ones to the leadership, you can feel it. Finally, most recently, I was pleased to see that Merrill Lynch, the bank, put out a country report on Vietnam, where it describes Vietnam as the emerging frontier of ASEAN, that it's a 10-year buy. Put your money there. You know, in 10 years, come back, and you'll see that it will have fructified. The economy is vibrant and rapidly growing, and the window of opportunity is really now. So in conclusion, I've said all this to encourage all of you to put Vietnam on your radar screens. I think Vietnam is on the move, and I hope it will continue to move in the right direction, and I hope you will continue to be interested in how fast and how well it moves. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for your very insightful and very exciting, stimulating lecture. Ambassador Nin has graciously agreed to take some questions. So here once again, please raise your hand and identify yourself, and then make your question or comment quite brief. Okay. So you want to start? Yeah. There's a microphone. Yeah.
About the modernization of Vietnam. After the Soviet Union stopped imposing its will on Eastern Europe, the Eastern Europeans quickly began to modernize by doing two things. One is to modernize their political system by building a democratic society. The other one is to build a free market. In the case of Vietnam, it has chosen to modernize by ignoring the first part of pursuing a free market. Could you, in your opinion, explain why Vietnamese people appear unable to pursue the first course, but only pursue the second course?
Thank you. That question is often asked. I think that, first of all, freedom is a whole. I don't believe that you can have only economic freedom, but of course, emphasis can be different. And I'd say that today, Vietnam is more democratic than it was before. But I'd say the pace, I agree that the pace is different. We are slower on political reforms and on democratization, very simply because it's more difficult. And it's not just in Vietnam. Look at the European Union. When they integrate, what did they integrate first? Not politically, but economically. Read the history of of European integration. And even today, their foreign policy, they can't yet have a common foreign policy. So I'd say that it's not the Vietnamese people that is unable to democratize. I think that the wish to democratize, I think, is universal in Vietnam. But I don't think it can be sequencing that this first or this second. The two go together, but I admit that there is more emphasis, on the economic side of it, and that the economic reforms move faster than the political reforms. That might change.
Yes. There's a microphone. Yeah.
Vietnamese are living here in the Bay Area, and I'd like to have two questions for you. Do you think that Vietnam is more capitalist today than it is socialist? Second question is, you talking about the promise of the future. The promise of the future has been 4,000 years, and I'm not talking about just today, but we continue on this path and always promise. And I think you live in, you are Huế, right? A Centraler. And you heard of that song of Trịnh Công Sơn about chờ mai này, and we've been waiting. So when is the government of Vietnam, when it will allow the people to have a chance to develop, to help with development of the country?
About capitalism and socialism, socialism is not there for me to touch. Very frankly, if you ask me, describe socialism, we're still scratching our heads. No, I'm very serious. Why? Because if you are serious, the events in Eastern Europe have been pushing everybody to think, including in Vietnam and including within the Vietnamese Communist Party. And it is because of all that today there are changes within the party too. The latest party congress, decided that party members would be allowed to enter into private businesses, to open up their own private businesses. But it took the party 20 years to come to that decision. Minds don't change that fast. And very frankly, a parenthesis, just ask here, try to ban guns. Will it happen tomorrow? You will have a fierce debate, right? And it might take, I don't know how many years. So all societies, have to decide for themselves how comfortable they are at the pace of change. So what I say is, don't ask for labels. We call it socialism. You may call it whatever you like. It's up to you. All we know is we're trying to find a market economy that has a human face, that pays attention to social justice and to culture and human development. Will we get there? I don't know. We are trying hard at the moment. Now, regarding development, the promise, my answer is this. We are doing it right now in Vietnam, so come back and try your hand at it. That's all. That's all I can say. There's no dichotomy on one side, the government, on the other side, the whole population. No. The young people that I see coming from Vietnam over here to study, that's what they are doing. I was meeting with a group of Vietnamese students over lunch, several of them coming from Vietnam, and they were already starting their own NGO here for leadership, youth leadership. And they have come back to Vietnam several times to interact with the young ones in Vietnam. So you see, I mean, perhaps we should talk less and act more. And the young ones are already doing it. So let us, encourage them and things will happen. How fast? It's up to all of us in Vietnam. And to the diaspora also, I believe. And we try to ask the diaspora to join a hand. We haven't been very good at it in the earlier years, but we're trying to do it better now. So this is my message to you and my answer to your second question.
Okay, any question?
Well, I wanted to raise a question which I know is on people's mind, and you refer to it now and again, which is the relationship of Vietnam to its neighbor, China. And this is a question that Americans are trying to think through themselves. What does the rise of China mean to us? And I wanted to know from a Vietnamese perspective, what does the rise of China mean to you, given the long history and a complicated history, as you alluded to, of your relationship with China?
Well, first of all, China and Vietnam are neighbors for eternity. I remember one of our politicians said, you can't export yourself, Vietnam is where it is, and China is definitely where it is. And you've lived, cohabited with China for centuries. Agreed, China today is not the empire of the middle or of the center, of centuries ago. And so, of course, we've got to think hard how to best live with China. Now, what I'd say is this. Politically, relations have never been better between Vietnam and China. If you take the historical perspective, check in our, many thousand years of, cohabitation with China, today is the best. The best, but not simple. The best meaning, compared to the past. Now, not simple in the sense that, of course, China is hungry for energy. And where is energy more closely, located in the region, right next to us, in the so-called East, what we call the Eastern Sea, and China calls the South China Sea, right? So there's bound to be problems and tensions, but we believe that we need to tread cautiously and steadily with an alert mind. And so, for example, when the Philippines signed a bilateral agreement, accepted to sign a bilateral agreement for joint exploitation of, of the area around the Mischief Island, it wasn't a very wise step, but Vietnam had no other option but jumping in to avoid it being simply bilateral, because of course Vietnam is one of the claimants, and so instead of a bilateral, it became a trilateral agreement. In other words, we need to to be very alert. On the other hand, what I would say, the economic rise of China, we have to learn to live with it. So, for example, among ourselves, what do we say? We should find niches market, niches product. We can't go mass scale. Mass scale and pricing on price, competing on price with China, hopeless. So what we do is look at the kind of products that China is not very good at producing or hasn't yet produced, and do it really good, and then you may stand a chance in the competition. Second, I would recall that our former Minister of Trade, Mr. Vu Hoan, when Vietnamese businesses were questioning him, saying, well, you know, that was just before China was going to enter WTO. Say, when China enters WTO, will be swarmed by, Chinese products. We won't be able to compete. So what Mr. Huan said was, look, export to China, because it works both ways. If, both we will be inside WTO. China exports easily to ASEAN. ASEAN should export to China. It's just next door. And we, particularly Vietnam, we have a common border, and we close to those provinces that are not the coastline provinces that are very, very rich and strongly developing. The hinterland, I think they are apt to use our consumer goods. So I mean, the message that was given by Mr. Vu Hoan really made sense. We have to compete back right in their backyard, rather than just defending ourselves on our own market. So I'd say there's no way then to try and be very alert, think hard of an appropriate strategy, and well, that's life. I don't see any other way. And of course, last point, and that's also the reason why Vietnam is a fervent multilateralist.
Harry Rowan, APARC. The excellence of your English brings to mind a question.
Thank you.
Harry?
The excellence of your English brings to mind a question. Returned recently from China, where it seemed like many of the young people were studying English and wanted to try it out on us. And it was really a lot of fun to meet all these young people who were studying English and wanting to talk in English. What about Vietnam? I mean, there's a lot to be said for especially finding a niche in the world market to have English as a language. Can you comment on the interest among young people in studying English?
Well, of course, English, English has no nationality today. I think it's English is becoming the de facto Esperanto of the world. So I always object to people saying, well, now that all young people speak English in Vietnam, it means we are moving closer to the Anglo-Saxon. Well, I mean, no. My interpretation is, you want to survive, you want to succeed in the globalized world, English is like IT, IT skills. You can't do with that. And so that's what I tell the young people in Vietnam. If you only know good English, that's not enough. Today, it's not a distinguishing feature anymore in Vietnam. So what I tell them is, you've got to learn a second foreign language, be it French, be it Spanish, be it Japanese, be it Chinese or Korean. That will distinguish you. So the young people in Vietnam are avid learners and fast learners, and the young ones I discuss with over lunch, I mean, they speak very good English, but the challenge for them will be not to know just English.
I'd like to return to the globalized world that you mentioned in the title of your talk. One aspect, I think, of the globalized world has been an erosion of the principle of national sovereignty, the old Westphalian idea that the boundaries around countries really are walls. And here's Vietnam getting ready to join the WTO, which illustrates that in the economic realm, Vietnam is participating in a globalized world. Now, I want to talk about Burma and ask you whether the position that Vietnam has taken with regard to Burma is perhaps a 19th century rather than a 21st century view. That is, Vietnam inside ASEAN, as you know, has been very reluctant to try to push Burma, however gently, towards political reform. Do you see any prospect of this policy changing in the future?
I will be very frank and honest with you. I don't think it's going to move much in the direction of, Vietnam directly trying to influence Myanmar towards greater reform. I think that what would happen is Vietnam would be more than happy if they came to us and we would volunteer, remarks and recommendations and whatnot. Very frankly, let me tell you a story. It is the Quaker, the AFSC organization, NGO, in Vietnam, that has been funding for several North Korean agronomists to come to Vietnam to study how to plant rice and grow rice more effectively. We're more than welcome to open our fields and to accompany their search for higher productivity. In other words, I think Vietnam is still reluctant to play a lead role in that kind of situation. On the other hand, when the need diplomatically has arisen to ensure the greater common good, Vietnam was quite proactive. Remember ASEM 5, right? It was the time when the 10 new EU members and 3 remaining members of ASEAN that were not yet part of ASEM were supposed to join. And the Europeans were very reluctant to attend ASEM if Burma was going to be there. And it was Vietnam that brokered a compromise whereby Myanmar was going to join together with Laos and Cambodia, but the Burmese delegation, Myanmar delegation, would not be at the head of state or government level, but only at the foreign minister's level. And there was a kind of gentleman's agreement that it would attend, but passively, meaning it wouldn't intervene or not take the floor. So I think diplomatically, Vietnam did not hesitate. But on internal reforms and questions of democratization, I think that is a bit early for Vietnam. Who knows, 10 years from now, Vietnam might be different, I don't know. But today, if you ask me tomorrow, I'd say, I don't think.
Anything else? Okay, so then before closing, let me announce that there will be reception just outside. So please enjoy reception, and also we're gonna have Asian Leaders Forum again in the fall. And once again, please join me in thanking Ambassador Ninh for a wonderful talk this evening. Thank you very much.